How's it going, everybody? It's good to see all your smiling faces for the second Q&A. I'm pretty tired today. I've dug up and potted a tree that was grown in the garden. That was hard work, but we got there in the end. Look forward to the video for that one. Anyway, let's dive into the first question then. Here we go. We've got Stuart Triplow who says, I read a post earlier today that a guy said he's grown bonsai in coco coir and pumice for many years. Could you confirm that this is okay for the trees? So there's a few questions about soil coming up on this one, so there might be some overlap in the answers. You can use just about any acceptable soil that plants are able to grow in for bonsai trees. What tends to vary is how quickly that soil dries out and how quickly the soil breaks down. Coco coir and pumice is quite a moisture retaining soil, so it might need less frequent watering. It might also, because coir is quite a fine particle and it does break down a bit, it might also need slightly more frequent repotting to keep the roots healthy. But you've got to experiment a little bit and see what works for your trees in your environment. Personally, for my bonsai trees, I use aggregate soils only because I have a very wet environment and these aggregates drain very quickly, and it also allows me to keep the trees in their pots without being repotted a little bit longer before it becomes an issue. If I were to use coco coir, even with pumice in it, in a shallow container, I would get root issues because of all the rain. This needs a video all of itself, but shallow pots can actually keep the roots wet for longer than a deeper pot, even though there's more actual water in a deeper pot. So the soil composition can be critical when you live in environments that can be a bit on the wet side. Also, it depends on the species of tree. I think if you were growing something like Scots pine or white pine in coir and pumice, you might start to see issues. They prefer a little on the drier side. So yeah, the species does come into it. You might find that ficus, elm, that kind of thing would be pretty happy in coir. You've got to experiment and see what works for you. And maybe if you can't get to your trees to water as frequently because you're away for work, you might choose to go for the coir route because it holds water for longer. But it does make it a little bit more prone to overwatering. And there's more on soil in a bit. Okay, so yeah, next question then. Barry Cox says, this was something that took me a long time to come to terms with, after being in horticulture professionally for many years. Why is bonsai soil different from the soil used in flower pots? Why can't/shouldn't we use normal dirt? So this is a good question. It probably deserves a separate video with a much more detailed explanation that I can go into in this one. In a container, you've got an artificial water table because the surface tension of the water that's in the pot combined with the enclosed environment means that some amount of liquid remains in the pot held by the surface tension of the water even after it's stopped draining. So you water, the soil becomes saturated, water comes out of the bottom, then eventually the water stops. You've still got a portion of water in the bottom of that container. And you can prove this by taking the pot after you've watered and it's finished draining, tilt it, and as long as there's drainage holes on the side that you're tilting it, more water is going to come out. Or if you water the pot and then scoop soil out, water will drain from the bottom. So there is a water table in the container. Now in a deeper flower pot, the water table would be something like the bottom, I don't know, third. And then the plant can choose where in the soil column to occupy with its roots because it's a deeper pot. If it's a water-loving species, it'll keep roots down in that wetter zone. In a shallower container, The water table might still be the bottom 30% of the soil, but the distance between the water table and the top is, instead of it being, I don't know, 15 centimetres or 6 inches in a flower pot, now it's, I don't know, 2-3 centimetres, an inch, maybe 2 inches. So the tree has got a lot less flexibility about where it can keep its roots. Now, on top of this, the finer the soil composition is, the finer the particles of the soil composition, the more water the soil can hold on to without it draining. So you can imagine that the roots already don't have a lot of leeway in terms of where they are happiest. But now if you've got a really fine dirt or a compost-based soil that holds more water, the water table can be even higher, and there's less space for oxygen in between the particles, so the roots are even more they're even more constrained about the conditions that they can tolerate. On the other hand, if you've got a larger particle, like an aggregate soil, like your akadama or your pumice, the larger particle holds on to less water, and so more of it drains out, so the water table's lower. And also, because of the shape of the particles, they don't fully, they don't interlock as well as the much smaller particles. There's more air space in between the particles. So not only is there a bit less water in the container, but there's more space for oxygen to penetrate as the water drains and then evaporates. So the roots can get the water they need to keep the tree hydrated, but also the oxygen that they need to avoid root rot. I hope that makes sense for a quick explanation, but I will make a slower, more detailed video separately to go over with some diagrams and whatnot to make that clearer. And then Sarmat 36 says, there are numerous grain sizes of inert substrates, from the finest to the biggest. What is the difference between the different grain sizes and how they should be used? So when we're talking about growing bonsai trees, some confusion can slip in, because we might be growing material for bonsai, or we might have a bonsai tree in a bonsai pot, and the two are slightly different. For this question, I'm going to assume we're talking about actual bonsai trees in the shallower bonsai pots. So the larger grain substrates are good if you live in a wet environment and you've got a species that particularly doesn't like to stay wet. The larger grain can let more air in and keep the roots happier, but mostly we use a larger grain substrate as the first layer in the bonsai pot. And some people call it a drainage layer, but that's not technically correct, because as I mentioned earlier, there's a water table, and that layer of particles actually raises the water table. It doesn't lower it, but that's probably a topic for another day. What it actually does is it allows more air to penetrate through the drainage holes at the bottom of the pot, as well as permeating from the top. So it allows better aeration at the bottom. Then you'll use the medium grain for the rest of the soil. One particle deep is the aeration layer. The rest of the substrate in your pot is the medium sized, sort of 3 to 5 millimeter. Larger grain might be 6 to 9, I don't know, whatever it is, I can't remember now. And then you've got the really small particles. These are for shohin trees in much smaller pots. The smaller particle holds water for longer, holds more water. So if you've got a really small pot, it can dry out quickly. So the finer particle holds the water longer, keeps the tree hydrated a bit better. Also, because the pot's small, the pot fills up with roots faster, so you tend to repot them a bit more frequently. So the smaller particle isn't a disadvantage in a small pot. In a bigger pot, where you might go, I don't know, 3 maybe even 5 years between repots, a really small particle size runs the risk of breaking down and becoming dust before you repot, and then that might lead to health issues. So a larger particle takes longer to break down into smaller and smaller particles until it gets to dust, so you can go longer between repots. That's it. That's all there is to it. So Daniel Fonseca says, I have this radiata pine which was an air layer. Ooh, an air layer. Let us know how you managed to get that to succeed. I'll be interested to learn. The root ball is amazing and it grew very vigorously, so I think it can take some hard bending. But how in the world do I bend this trunk? It's annoyingly straight and about as thick as a thumb most of the way up the trunk. Raffia and thick wire. Trunk split, brackets, I've never done one. What to do? Thank you. It's about 3 centimeters at the base, about 2 centimeters most of the trunk, and about 1.5 centimeter diameter at the top. So the bit we were looking to bend is about, I don't know, not quite an inch thick. Just have a look at these images. I think some annealed copper wire will do it. 5 or 6 mil. I'm not sure how that translates to the wire gauges. But it's pretty much the thickest bonsai wire you can get. I don't think you're going to need raffia. Get the wire on, think about where you want to bend it, and try and get the wraps of the wire to go in the same direction. So if you're bending the branch sort of down and then up that way, wrap the branches accordingly, and vice versa. And as you plan out your wiring, try to get each coil of wire to hit the inside of the bend you want to make, because that's going to act almost like a fulcrum. Then when you do make the bend at each location, watch the outside to see if there's any green tissue becoming visible through the bark. If you start to see that, then stop bending. You've gone far enough. Then move on to the next piece. You'll have to really think hard about where you position your hands in order to get good leverage. When you're working with really thick copper wire, it's as difficult to bend the wire as it is to bend the branch or the trunk that you're bending. I'm saying the word bend a lot now. But the copper itself becomes as hard to maneuver as the branch that you've wired it onto. So you've got to sort of go further, back off a bit, go a bit further, back off, go a bit further, and each bend you sort of ease it into position, and as the annealed copper work hardens, it'll become stiffer and stiffer, and soon enough it'll hold that section in place, and then you work on the next bit. At that thickness, obviously you're not going to be able to tie it in knots like you can with a pencil thick whip, but I certainly think you'll be able to put some movement into that section with just a standard thick piece of copper wire. Give it a go, let us know how it goes. Okay, let's move on to the next question then. So Tim Freeman says, I know we should read the tree to know when spring repotting should happen, but are there some species that you should be potting at other times of the year? Because you've got people saying, you should repot larch early in the year in January, and then other people say you should repot larch when the buds are starting to glow, and you've got other people say that they repot larch in the summer. Well, whenever all different people are saying lots of different things, kind of tells you that you can actually do like any of those options. There might be different pros and cons to each approach, and you need to decide what works for you. The only thing, I think spring repotting for most species is pretty reliable. The tree's coming out of dormancy, so it's got plenty of energy, but the weather conditions aren't too challenging for recovery. It's whatever works for you. There are some species that I think are probably better repotted in the summer, and those are the ones that need the heat for root regeneration. But your tropicals, they generally prefer to be repotted when it's warm. Portulacaria afra, they produce roots most vigorously when it's warm. They love the heat. They've got no chance of dehydrating to death because they're succulent and they carry the water and they're fine. I think you've got to sort of pick an approach, really. I do the bulk of my repotting in the spring when the trees are coming out of dormancy, apart from like succulents and tropicals that I do in the summer. That's what works for me. It's, you know, there's a lot less going on because I've got less pruning and styling to do. I have a polytunnel so I can protect from the excess rain that we get in the UK. That works for me. I do think that I haven't tested this in the UK, but I do know that over at Marai they repot their pines very early January. Haven't tested that here. Mugos as well. Mugo pine. A lot of people say they need to be repotted in the summer. I've repotted an old Mugo in the spring. At the traditional time, it was fine. It's doing really well, and it's just won a prize in a show. It doesn't belong to me. Somebody else has bought it and styled it. I'm just saying that, you know, it's healthy enough to win a prize. Didn't suffer too much from the spring repotting. I also suspect that they might be good to repot during the Marai window. I think pines start producing their spring root growth pretty early, so if you come in at the traditional sort of March, April sort of window, you're cutting off a lot of the growth that's already happened in the roots, and so that might be what causes a lot of confusion. That's just a theory now, I'm just thinking out loud. Does that help? I don't know. Okay, anyway, let's go on to the next one. Okay, perfect. And then the next question is, where are we? Frank Etchells. This maple has had me perplexed on what to do with it for the last 6 years. Air layer, but where? Or chop? It's a Kotohime or Kiyohime or similar, so it's a dwarf leaf variety. It's got brittle growth which easily snaps if trying to do a branch graft, etc. No surface roots on one side / back. Large bulge as seen, and 3 different colour bark from the graft stock, grafted variety, and then the branch coming off. I've asked about this in a couple of other groups previously. Let's have a look at these pictures. Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, it's a bit of a Frankenstein tree almost. With, you've got the rootstock, which is a really pretty cool base. Apparently it's one-sided. I can't see the reverse, but from what we can see it looks pretty good. And onto that base we've got this green section that's not got much taper. And then onto that green section we've got the dwarf variety grafted as a single branch. So I guess someone's used this as grafting practice, or maybe they were looking to create a taller tree with a smaller leaf. And so the question is, where do we go from here then? Just going to zoom into this picture here. Yeah, okay, yeah. So the issue is the 3 different bark colours. It's always going to look random. That middle section, that green section, it doesn't have any taper. I think it's always going to look a little bit odd, this one, unless you put it in the ground and grow it out such that everything thickens, and then it will kind of blend a bit better. That'll take a number of years. If you want more of a short-term option, what I suggest is you cut the top back somewhere around here on each branch, so that we get new whips stimulated to grow. And then as those whips are growing, you want to bend them, say midsummer, depending on when you prune. If you prune sort of early summer, bend them towards the end of the summer or in the autumn. You'll have to wire them carefully because they may not have lignified, but the point is that if you train them down almost as they grow, you won't have that brittleness to contend with. So you're almost growing them into position rather than growing them out, then wiring them into position. I think what I would do is I would do one thread graft sort of lower on the base, second thread graft a little bit higher on the base, and then the higher one will be your new trunk leader, the lower one will be the first branch. And then over time, as those grafts take, we're going to cut that green section off, heal over the wound, and we'll have our dwarf variety grafted onto the nice thick base. That's the approach that I would take. And then once those branches have taken, you could maybe air layer from the top if you want to. I don't know, I probably wouldn't. To fix the one-sided base, you've got a couple of options. You could get some cuttings or seedlings and approach graft them in to form new roots on that side. You may have bark mismatch issues, or you could, when you repot, you could find a nice long root and pin it in place as an approach graft. Then the second option, when you next repot, you cut all the roots back quite hard, and then you do almost like a partial ground layer where the gap is, pack it with sphagnum, and hope that cutting the other roots back and doing that partial ground layer will stimulate new roots in that area. Which approach you take? I would probably try grafting first, if possible. Ideally, you have a nice long root that you can pin in place, sort of loop it back, and then do an approach graft, pin it in the place, and then hope that it takes. I think that's what I would do. Skylar Cousin says, what are the best times of year to do larger chops? I know we live in different zones, so seasonality would be best. Yeah, so I follow the Mirai school of thought on doing chops. You've got three main windows of opportunity. In the spring, just before the buds start pushing. There's a caveat on that we'll come back to later. Then in the sort of early summer, when the first push of growth is finished, the leaves have hardened off and the tree's had a chance to recoup some of that energy. So a couple of weeks after they've hardened off is a good time. And then the third window is in the autumn/fall, when the tree's just going into dormancy. You can do that's another good window for doing chops. Now, the caveat of spring is there are species that will leak sap everywhere. Japanese maple, beech, hornbeam, potentilla. Some people are bothered by that, some people aren't. That's a separate debate. With those species, if you prune them, if you hard prune in the summer or the autumn, they won't leak sappy, watery sap everywhere. If you're talking tropicals, I'd go in the summer. Temperate, either or. It also, to a certain extent, depends what kind of response you'd like. In the summer, I think you get slightly less of an aggressive response if you prune in that sort of early summer window. You know, the internodes might not be quite as big, it might not be quite as explosive. Doing a hard prune, you know, a drastic chop in the autumn or the spring, you tend to get a boom. Okay, so from the Discord server, Short and Ginger says, can I air layer pyracantha? It's got a 2-inch trunk, and when would be the best time? What sort of time frame would I expect it to take? Many thanks. So yeah, pyracantha respond really well to air layers. I think I sent you a pyracantha. That was an air layer itself. The best time I find to place most air layers is just as the first flush of growth starts to harden off, so the leaves develop a waxy coating instead of that sort of soft fleshy feel that they've got. Do the air layer then. Pyracantha root pretty easily, so it could be as soon as 6 weeks, depends how healthy the plant is. It could take right up until the next summer if the plant isn't very healthy or if there are issues with the air layer. But yeah, you can expect it to be pretty quick, a couple of months, and I would hope to be seeing roots on a pyracantha that's healthy. Good luck with your air layer, let us know how it goes. Question is from Tony Morand over on the Facebook community. Links down below if you want to join. And his first question is, what is the best way to water bonsai trees? To slowly dunk them in water till no more bubbles, or to use a water can until water comes out the drainage holes? So you can use both approaches, and they each have different pros and cons. So watering from the top, either with a hose pipe or a watering can, flushes the water through the pot from the top all the way down. So it's pretty good in the sense that it can completely alleviate any stale air. It can draw the fertilizer from the surface down. It's also a constant source of fresh water, so there's a lot less chance of any disease or what have you being transferred from tree to tree. Dunking is exceptionally thorough, so if your tree's been underwatered, it can be really good to fully rehydrate that soil so the tree can recover. Also, during times of drought, dunking can be a bit more water efficient because a lot less water gets spilled everywhere, although you do tend to end up with a bucket or a bowl of water at the end that just gets dumped. But in the UK we have hosepipe bans, and so you can fill up a container and dunk, but you're not allowed to use the hose pipe. So that's a way of getting around it. Disadvantage with the hose is that sometimes the water can bounce off the soil surface, and so it doesn't get fully saturated, so you have to do it once, let the water go through, water again, and sometimes if the soil is exceptionally dry, a third time. So it can be a bit tricky depending on the condition of the root system and the makeup of the soil. There isn't one right way of watering. You know, it's a case of which is the most suitable for your situation. Oh, also dunking is a bit more convenient if your trees are indoors. You know, it can be quite messy with a watering can indoors. So yeah, there's that. Okay, another one from Tony. This is my brush cherry. It keeps dropping leaves. The soil is moist but not dry. Okay, so diagnosing things like this is more a case of process of elimination. So I can point out the most common causes, and then you can sort of try and figure out which applies best. So leaves can be dropped if they are if they're shaded from above. If they're not getting enough light, the tree can shed the interior leaves and grow longer to try and stretch out and search out more light. So it could be that the tree isn't getting enough light and those interior leaves are dropping. I had a little look at the picture and it looks like that could be what's going on. The lower branches and the interior twigs seem to have lost their leaves, whereas the upper and the outer seem pretty healthy. So that's my suspicion. But other causes can be a sudden change of environment, under or over watering, pests and disease, seasonal changes. Leaves don't live forever. Even on evergreen trees, they get replaced. So it could just be a normal thing called senescence. Sometimes too much fertilizer can cause what looks like watering, underwatering or overwatering. So that could be a thing to consider. But as I said, looking at the picture, I think it's insufficient light. Also, if the top of the tree gets very strong, the tree can sort of say, well, you know, I'm trying to make the most energy I can from the light that's available. The lower branches aren't doing so great. The top ones are really strong, and it can just say, oh, I don't need these lower branches. I'll just kill those, and that's what could be happening. So I think with yours, I think it could be that the top's getting strong, so it needs to be pruned and thinned out, or there isn't enough light getting through to the lower branches. In fact, is that the same thing? Sounds like the same thing when I say it out loud. Anyway, that's what I think is going on there. And then the same question applies to the Sarissa that Tony's shown us. Yeah, some of those leaves are looking a little off colour. Could be a watering issue or pests, maybe spider mites, maybe scale insects. Have a look there. But I think light's a strong one for your Sarissa as well. Okay, on to the next one then. Okay, Julie Stainer says, I'm very new to bonsai and I have rescued a dried out tree from a DIY shop. I was wondering what tree is it and what should I do with it now? I gave it a little lift to see how well it sat in the pot and it looks like it has a root ball with very loose substrate around it. Its leaves, although green, are dried out and crispy. So the species is Buxus, and what should we do with this? So what's happened is the DIY shops, they don't tend to do a great job of keeping them watered and cared for. So at some point on the shelf it became totally dehydrated to the point where the leaves have dried right out without even falling off or going brown or anything. They just went boom, too dry, and they've been essentially preserved, and that's why they're still green. They're dead, but you know, they don't look dead. It's the dryness and the brittleness that confirms that. That it dried out so quickly means that the chances of it being deceased are quite high, but not 100%. So it could be that the tree managed to sort of go kind of dormant. The leaves dried out, but the trunk itself isn't completely dead. So all you can really do is give it plenty of light and water it only when the soil's dry. It sounds weird, the plant's dried out, so now you've got to let it dry before you water it. But when the tree's got no leaves, it's not using any water. So if you keep it hydrated, the roots stay saturated, the soil stays saturated as well. There's no room in the soil for oxygen, so the roots, or what roots there are, can start to rot. So it's important that you let the soil dry out, that draws air into the soil, then you water, and repeat this cycle. Otherwise you can get root rot as well as the existing stress that the plant's trying to cope with. That's all you can do really. If it gets to like midsummer and it hasn't produced any new buds and shoots, it's dead. That's all there is to it, I'm afraid. Yeah, shame. Okay, so the next question is from Pearl Paxton. I was a brand new bonsai owner and it died on me within some months, and to this day I still don't know what I did to kill it. Or was it dying before I even got it? I was sad watching it die. It's very common as a newcomer to bonsai to lose the first tree. We tend to buy cheaper trees because, we don't know if we're going to get on with the hobby, and lower cost trees are sort of more available. You can get them in the supermarket, hardware stores, garden centres. So, but the disadvantage is they don't tend to be well maintained and looked after, so they're actually easy to kill. And a lot of the times, as I said earlier, they can already be dead and they just don't look it. So it could be you did absolutely nothing wrong. Then some common mistakes, a lot of the time it's due to misinformation. Bonsai can be a challenging hobby, and then keeping your trees indoors actually makes it even more challenging, because then you've got the still air that we've got in our homes, you've got the reduced light because even the brightest window filters sunlight. So by keeping it indoors, it's extra challenging. Another common issue is underwatering or overwatering. So underwatering kind of speaks for itself. Don't if it doesn't get watered enough, dries out, boom, it passes away. But overwatering is a common trap, because as a newcomer you think, well, if I just keep it watered, it won't get underwater, it won't dry out, and it'll be happy. But as I've sort of touched on earlier in the video, if you water it, if you keep the soil too wet, the roots don't get enough oxygen that they need, and that causes the roots to die and rot. The tree then can't sustain itself, it can't stay hydrated because it's got no roots, and so it perishes. without seeing pictures or knowing more about the story, it's hard to say what happened really. Yeah, hard luck. I'm sorry you lost your first tree. Follow along with the videos. I'll be doing more care videos soon, so keep an eye out for those, and maybe try again with a healthier tree. We can advise you on what to get, down to the which tree looks the healthiest. So yeah, I hope you try again. I hope you stick with it. But yeah, it happens. Don't beat yourself up. Does it sound callous saying that? It happens. But it does, you know, plants do die, they don't live forever. And that's the last question. So if you have questions, shoot them down in the comments below. I'll get to them, but I do prioritise the Discord server and Facebook community. I do read them all, but I may not be able to answer them all in this video. Also, if you use the Discord or the Facebook, it makes it easier to show images so that I can see what we're talking about, whereas in the comments, we don't have that. Okay. It's repotting season in the Northern Hemisphere, so I hope it all goes well. I hope you have lots of fun, and I will see you in the next video.